Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here in the Arizona desert to do a review of the Zeiss Distagon T 15mm f2.8 lens. And Zeiss was kind enough to give me a copy of this lens for this particular opportunity, and I've had a chance to take it to the Grand Canyon and out into the desert here in Arizona, and to make some good use of its great capabilities. This, of course, is one of Zeiss's premium lenses. It's not a cheap lens. It runs around right under $3,000, and as most Zeiss lenses, it is a manual focus only lens. The combination of the price and along with being manual focus only are the two things that are most off-putting to potential buyers about this particular lens. But if you can get beyond both of those things and look to the true merits of the lens, you will discover one of the finest options there is for shooting landscapes and other types of shooting that require a true ultra wide angle lens. The 15mm focal length, of course, produces very dramatic images. And in my experience, that is one of the great challenges for people that are unfamiliar with shooting with ultra wide angle lenses. They require a very different mentality when it comes to composition and shooting because the ultra-wide focal length, it creates the illusion of distance. Because of that, you can really take some terrible pictures with a ultra-wide angle lens. But if you learn to use an ultra-wide perspective properly, it produces some of the most dynamic, epic photos that you will ever take in your lifetime. And it's for that reason that I find this to be a very compelling lens. And so as we get down into the basics of the lens itself, this of course is a 15mm prime lens. The lens design starts fairly narrow near to the camera mount, but as it begins to move out towards the focus ring, it tapers into the first tapered section, and then it has a finely ribbed metal focus ring that is amongst, even though Zeiss lenses always focus very smoothly and are damped beautifully, this application is perhaps one of the smoothest that I've yet encountered, and it has a minimal amount of resistance. And one thing that does set it apart from a lot of other Zeiss options is that the actual focus throw is actually quite small. It's only about and this is just a rough estimation, but I would say around a 30-degree rotation from close focus out to infinity. And so it's very easy to make rapid focus changes with this particular lens. But then it has one more final taper, and that is out to the housing for the front element, along with a built-in lens hood that is always there. And of course in metal, everything in the construction of this is metal and glass. As I've said before, Zeiss doesn't know what plastic is. And so it comes out into a permanently fixed lens hood along with a 95mm front element. The nice thing about this lens, and one thing that really sets it apart from some of the other ultra-wide angle options, that it actually has threads for a traditional filter. Now a 95mm front filter is expensive, there's no question about that, but when it comes to comparing to the price of other square type filter systems that are sometimes added on for other lenses, I've got such a thing for the Rokinon 14mm f2.8, and there are similar systems available for Nikon's 14mm to 24mm lens. But those add-on systems, they tend to be, number one, expensive, and number two, they are fairly cumbersome and bulky to use. You're certainly not just going to throw them into your camera bag, but rather you really need to kind of plan around the application of those things. And so because of that, that is one intrinsic advantage that this Zeiss Distagon lens has, is the ability to use traditional filters. Overall, the design and the build quality of this is like many other Zeiss products, amongst the finest of any lens on the planet, and its build is exquisitely good, made of high-grade materials, and because of that, it is not a light lens. Weight is really what I would call more of a medium weight. It's certainly not overly heavy or cumbersome for someone that's familiar with shooting with even say a 24 to 70mm f2.8 zoom, and so in that sense, it's not a difficult lens to bring along. As you move beyond the build quality, you begin to actually examine the lens in use. There's a few things that I want to highlight here. Number one, as I've already said, the focus action is extremely smooth. Some people, of course, are put off by this lens being manual focus only. But I have found that the truth of the matter is that wide angle options are really, they're not a challenge to focus for one primary reason, and that is that the wide focal length means that it is very easy to have an extremely deep depth of field. And if I were to use the example, even shooting wide open at f2.8 with this lens, you could focus out about 5 feet, and you would already have a depth of field at f2.8 at that point that is nearly 15 feet deep. And if you stop the lens down to f4, that same depth of field moves up, doubles to over 30 feet. And then if you stop it down to f5.6, the depth of field becomes infinite from about 2.5 feet out to infinity. And so if you understand those basic principles, it's not difficult to focus. And this lens will focus down very close, under 10 inches. And so that means that you are able to have a decent maximum magnification because of that close focus. And it allows you to do some unique shots where you really emphasize something in your foreground, and then you can throw a lot of the actual environment into the photo as well. And I've had a lot of fun with that out in the desert, shooting with cactuses and things like that. The lens is very sharp from wide open, and one of the reasons why this lens merits its high price tag is because it offers resolution and contrast that surpasses basically anything else out there. And there's basically about one other lens that, and it's not quite as wide as this, but the Canon Tilt Shift 17mm that really can compete in terms of ultimate resolution with this particular lens. But it's not just the resolution, which fortunately does extend out into the periphery of the image. And so unlike a lot of the popular zooms, you don't have to worry about your corners looking mushy with this lens. And so it's sharp from wide open. The f2.8 is not a marketing gimmick. It's very usable at that wide aperture. But beyond that, this lens has the superlative image contrast and micro contrast that I associate with some of the finest Zeiss lenses, and really that I see only imitated by other Zeiss lenses. There's something about the optical formula in these that allows there to be an extreme, if I could use the term, pop to the images, where if you examine in the details, not just the global contrast of an image, but if you get down into the fine details and magnify an image, you will find that there is extreme contrast and resolution even in the details, which is particularly important when you're shooting a landscape type image. It allows for those details to be finely resolved and produces some really stunning images. On top of that, you have the exceptional color accuracy and richness of color that's associated with Zeiss lenses, and the reason why they're so prized by many photographers and videographers. And because of that, there are those that have reported that they have found that their processing time has really reduced because there's already so much great color accuracy along with contrast in the images that they look great straight out of the camera. Produce stunning images because of those combinations, and then also kind of the extreme nature of the focal length. And it was a pleasure to use in places like the Grand Canyon and Sedona here in Arizona, along with out in the desert. I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona right now, and surrounding us there are some great mountains and hiking trails, and I've had a great deal of pleasure using this lens in those kinds of settings, and it produced some really stunning images that I'm very happy to share with you. Ultra-wide lenses, by nature, they come with some perspective distortion. In terms of actual lens distortion, this lens has some minor barrel distortion that actually is towards the better part of its class. But all lenses, ultra-wide lenses, have perspective distortion, and that distortion is either minimized or maximized dependent upon how you actually compose and how that the sensor is tilted in relation to your subject. And so in some settings where I want to get, for example, out here with these saguaro cactuses, sometimes when I'm shooting them, I don't want them leaning, I want them to stand up nice and straight. And so I just have to make sure to have the actual sensor at a relatively flat plane with them. And when you do that, that perspective distortion is minimized. Of course, there are other settings where, say, with all of the great rocks that are out here in the desert, I want to emphasize a foreground. And so when I do that, often shooting in a portrait orientation, I actually will tilt the camera sensor somewhat, and so the foreground is emphasized and distorted, but in a positive way. And so if you learn how to use ultra-wide angle lenses, they can produce some really stunning, unique images, which is part of why I love using them. There are some significant shortcomings. The significant shortcomings above all being price, and of course for some it will be that it is a manual focus only lens. Beyond that, in terms of optical shortcomings, really the only thing that I can point to is that in my experience I'm shooting with a couple of Canon 6D bodies for this review, I have found that the lens tends to underexpose, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 stop, and so I have to compensate for that. Beyond that, this lens produces almost no chromatic aberrations or fringing in the field, which aids in it having very sharp, usable images right out of the box. On top of that, it also has great flare resistance. One other thing that's, to me, a very, very strong positive for this lens that is head and shoulders above the Rokinon 14mm lens that I have reviewed before and that I use quite often, is that the Rokinon produces very boring sun stars. There are, I think, about 6 blades that come off of them, and they're very boring. By contrast, this lens produces some stunning 18-pointed sunburst or sun stars that really had a stunning touch to images that frankly are lacking sometimes in some of the images I've taken with the Rokinon. And so that's a big plus for this lens. Now, one other thing that some have experienced, and I have to confess I've experienced myself, is regarding the actual lens cap. And like some other wide-angle options that have a fixed lens hood, the cap is one that actually fits over the top of the blades of the lens hood. In this particular application, the Zeiss cap does not use any kind of clip system, but rather seems to rely primarily on suction, and a kind of suction that's created by that when you put it on. Some have helped that, and this example here has a little bit of gaffer tape inside to help to aid with that. But in most applications, that works fine. I tend to, when I'm out in the woods or out in the desert like this, I often will use a black rapid strap or something equivalent to that, where I'm carrying the lens with it kind of dangling like this. And I found that when I was in cold climates, like when I was out near the Grand Canyon and it was quite cold up there, that because everything is metal, there is a bit of a contraction that takes place. And when the temperatures are colder, it means it's more likely for that lens cap to fall off. And in fact, it did fall off on me one time while walking a path near the Grand Canyon, and unfortunately, because it is metal, while it's not heavy, it has a bit of heft to it, and of course it fell on very rocky type path, and so there was some very minor cosmetic damage towards the edge that it fell on. And so that is a bit of a concern, and others have reported that they have had a similar problem. In most applications, this is not going to be an issue, but the only other place where this does become a bit of an annoyance is if you have the lens in some kind of case, as I often do, and you go to pull it out. If there's any kind of friction around the edges of this lens cap, you will pull the lens out and the lens cap will remain behind. And so it's not my favorite design in that sense, but that is a relatively minor annoyance. And the plus side is that because you can put a filter over that front element, you can protect it in other ways, and that's a very big advantage to me. And so in conclusion, if you are looking for, basically, I call this lens the Mercedes of its particular field. There are a lot of wide-angle options out there, and fewer when you get into the ultra-wide angle of 15mm or wider options out there. This is the most expensive of them all, but the image quality is superlative. Like the price, the image quality is at the absolute top in terms of resolution, color fidelity, and also just when it comes to minimizing ghosting and chromatic aberrations, and it has very low coma, and so I've been able to produce, on a few occasions that I've had here on this trip, I've been able to produce some stunning night sky images, and stars are rendered as very fine, accurate points with great contrast between the bright lights of the stars and the darkness of the sky. And so that also speaks to another strength of the lens, and that it seems to handle dynamic range particularly well. And I've noted this with a few of Zeiss lenses, that while dynamic range is ultimately determined by the sensor in your camera, it seems like Zeiss lenses do a better job handling those scenes that have extreme highlights and then also shadows. And they work really well in those situations, and really are an asset to a photographer in those kind of settings. In the period that I've had this lens, I have produced some images that I'm very proud to share from it. And I think that for anyone who is willing to make the investment, while it is a high risk in terms of price, it is equally high reward in terms of the images that you can produce. This is a lens that is well worth your consideration and probably well worth your money. It is the cream of the crop. It is the superlative lens in this class, and it's been a pleasure to use it for this period of time. And hopefully you've been able to enjoy this review and enjoy some of the images I've been able to take in the beautiful American Southwest with it. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and any questions that you type below, I'll do my best to respond to. And you can also take a look at the linkage below at links to either purchase the lens or to look at my more thorough written review that will have many, many other images along with it, along with some full-size samples for you to download and take a look at. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.